Hello, everybody, and blessings on this feast of Saint Rita, the saint of the impossible, patroness also of mothers and those in abusive relationships. She's the patron of the impossible because she overcame so many things that were seemingly impossible to realize the will of God. And really that synced up with her own desires from the beginning. As a child, she was deeply in love with Christ and wanted to give herself completely to him as a religious. And there was an Augustinian convent in Kasha, and that's where she wanted to spend her days, to become a bride of Christ. And yet it was not the will of God. Her parents had betrothed her to a man to be married, and so she was obedient, but this man turned out to be abusive, violent, had many enemies, and so it was that she persevered, praying for his conversion. And in that, she had two sons. I think they were twins, and they kind of followed in their father's footsteps. But in the end, she prevailed. Her husband, even though he kind of persisted in his way almost until death, he did convert before actually being murdered. And so he changed his ways. He came back to God. He went to confession and was reconciled before he lost his life. And then her two sons, at the death of their father, they wanted to avenge him, so they were set on getting that revenge. But she prayed fervently for them, even to the point that they would lose their lives before giving in to such a grave sin. And so it happened that they both came down with an illness, and so it was that they were able to be reconciled to God, and they both died before avenging the death of their father. And so, having suffered all of this, Saint Rita was then free from the bond of marriage with the death of her husband and not responsible for her children anymore. She sought to enter the convent, but the nuns didn't want to receive her with all of this baggage, thinking, and so they resisted receiving her at the convent. But Rita persisted. She persevered in her prayers. And so with the help of her heavenly patron, St. Augustine, the patron of the Augustinians, St. Nicholas of Tolentino, another great Augustinian monk, and then St. John the Baptist. She had those three heavenly helpers that made it possible for her eventually, after persevering and making many attempts to enter the convent, that finally she did. And so she lived in the convent for the rest of her life. And it was there that she received the stigmata. She, praying, it was later in her life, she asked for a share in the suffering of Christ. This woman who had shared so many of his sufferings. And that's what makes her amazing and the patroness of the impossible, as she recognized that it was Christ in her life, through her sufferings, that was drawing her on, that he was present through it all, and so united her life completely to his. And so she was able to realize the will of God. And so there it was in the convent that Christ gave her that gift of sharing in his suffering. She received the crown of thorns, or just one of the thorns right here in her forehead. So when you see Saint Rita, oftentimes there's just that one little wound or a ray of light coming from the crucifix right onto her forehead. And the suffering that came with it wasn't necessarily the pain. She had, if you can imagine, probably a headache every day with the pain of the crown of thorns. But what was maybe more humiliating was the stench that came off, and the suffering that she would have to endure because none of her sisters wanted to be around her because that stench was so putrid. There was a miracle associated with that, though, and that she longed to go to Rome in the holy year, the Jubilee of 1450. And so she begged her superior that she could go along with the sisters that were making pilgrimage to Rome. And Mother Superior said, well, as long as you've got that thing on your head, you can't go. And so she begged the Lord, and boom, within moments, the wound was healed. She was able to go to Rome and enjoy the graces of the Holy Year, to go through the holy doors and be a pilgrim in Rome and see the Holy Father, I'm sure. And then she returned to the convent, and boom, it returned. So it really was a grace that she received and endured for all those years. I think she endured it for some 15 years up into her death. And many miracles were associated with her during her life, and especially right after her death. She was venerated as a saint almost immediately, and when they uncovered her coffin to bring it up, they found her incorrupt, and so her body is still laying there in the church in Kasia for all to view. And I've been there. I visited St. Rita. When did I visit her? I visited her somewhere in the early 2000s. I was visiting Assisi with a seminarian classmate of mine, and we had no itinerary, no agenda. We were in Assisi for a few days, and he wanted to do something. I can't remember what he did that day, but I said, I'm going to Kasia. So I got on a train and went to Kasia and made my way there to the Basilica and to visit St. Rita. And two things stand out for me that day. It was, it's a beautiful city, Kasia, medieval walled city, much like Assisi, but on the top of a hill and much smaller than Assisi. And so as I visited there, it was just breathtaking, a wonderful experience. And as I was visiting St. Rita at her tomb, the thing that sticks out to me the most, the most prevalent memory that I have there in the church, was encountering this young family. There was a mother and a father and a child in a stroller, probably a toddler, maybe 3 years old. And as I was there praying, the little one, this child, started to talk to me, right? And it was one of those occasions where I was like, if only I spoke Italian. And so I longed to understand what the child was saying, and I tried to communicate with the parents, but it was such a genuine and beautiful encounter that I had with this child, and it made it, as you can tell, a deep impression as I remember all these years later. It was just joyful, a delight that I had at the tomb of St. Rita. And then after visiting her tomb and praying there with her, the saint of the impossible, I don't know if I had any intentions that I brought to her, but surely she is a great advocate for us in our trials, especially to persevere. After visiting the upper basilica, there's a crypt down below, and so I went down below, and little did I know there's a Eucharistic miracle right there. And I went in, and boom, there it is. It's right there in front of me. I had no clue, but this was a Eucharistic miracle that had happened in Siena. There was an Augustinian priest in Siena, And as it happened, I think there was a parish priest, a diocesan priest, or a secular priest, if you will, who was struggling with his devotion and faith in the Eucharist. And on one occasion, he was going to make a sick call, and we usually carry the Blessed Sacrament in a pyx, made of precious metal. We carry it around our neck and treat it with reverence as we carry it. Well, this priest, he took the Blessed Sacrament, the host, and stuck it in his breviary, or the ritual book that he was going to use for the anointing of the sick. And so he just took the host, threw it in there, and he was on his way. And he gets to the house where the sick person is, and goes to administer the last rites, the viaticum, and he opens the ritual book, and the pages are stuck together because the host began to bleed. And so that host with the pages is preserved at the church in Cascia, because it was an Augustinian priest in Siena that was the guardian of this miracle, and then he took it with him and is now venerated in Cascia. You might be able to look it up online. If I can find the link, maybe I'll place it in the description. And there's an interesting detail about this Eucharistic miracle is that if you look at it, you're going to see the profile of a face that looks much like Christ. In seemingly impossible situations, Christ reveals himself to us. When our faith is perhaps lacking, wanting, there he is ready to reveal himself to us. So in these days, let us keep looking for his presence, and may Saint Rita always be there to help us to recognize how Christ is present to us, even in our trials and in our sufferings. We hear in our gospel today that the Lord is always encouraging us. Let not your hearts be troubled.